IIT. I'd like to now recognize the member of opposition.
The official stance taken by a state on the actions of yesterday must be weighed in with accordance to how it affects our policies today. In our extension, we will say that in the context of Abenomics, where Japanese nationalism has moved on from the kind of jingoism that all sides tend to hate, where Shinzo Abe won the election on an economic plan, where he's instituted reforms which requires people to opt into a kind of nationalism and pay huge amounts of taxes, hurting the sentiments of large segments of the people will make the Japanese economic recovery significantly harmful. Then I talk about why Japan might need to militarize given the current territorial tensions and how this hurts that. And thirdly, I talk about what China will do, something opening government brought about and shockingly was not responded to by opening operation. Before I move into that, a few quick points of the topic. Firstly, they say that the Japanese soldiers see themselves as part of a whole and they're agents of their own actions. A lot of it was asserted, especially in the context of my POI, where I asked, will North Korean military be responsible? All he said is North Koreans are poor and therefore not able to walk into the system. We think that you're ideologically brainwashed. When you see someone as God, it's rather hard to have a rational debate with that person. And when they tell you it's important for the purity of your race to go ahead and commit certain actions, it's rather difficult to do so. Secondly, we don't quite see why the current Shinzo Abe has to say that all the Japanese soldiers were bad, when he could simply say, Hiro was bad and he oppressed us, just like Merkel doesn't have, Angela Merkel doesn't have to say that all Germans were bad, and except has to say that Hitler was bad, and the Turkish government can say the Ottomans were bad, as opposed to our population is culpable in these kinds of crimes. Then they said, and both sides, like closing borrowed this extension from opening. Right? Opening said the ideology cannot be acceptable in modern spheres. The closing essentially repackaged that by saying Japanese culture needs to accept that in a modern time. I have two responses. Firstly, we reject the notion that Japanese currently believe that it's acceptable to commit war crimes. Not once in their three speeches have they established that that's what the Japanese military actually believes or has been committing some similar acts since the World War II. Secondly, closing made a contradiction when they pointed out that Japan has moved on to pacifism, right? Which quite simply means that Japan is trying to move on from the atrocities of that era. And if Japan were to have sentiments of vengeance which need to be quelled, we point out to you that given the fact that they were the victims of war crimes committed by the United States in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they would not have gone ahead with nuclear non-proliferation. Given the fact that they have managed to move on from the wounds of that time, their argument that this nationalism is so vindictive simply falls flat on its face. Finally, argue for 3 minutes as to why war crimes are bad. We simply say we agree. Closing, finally argue that look, this shows that we need to have a nationalism as independent of this history that was blatantly asserted in the face of all the analysis provided by opening opposition as to how large numbers of people will be deeply offended. Not once did they say why that's actually possible. Moving on to my first extension, economics and how this hurts that, right? We believe in an economic system where you need to pay large amounts of taxes when your economy is coming out from decades of deflationary status, whereby large people's spending powers have been significantly diminished, requires you to buy into the idea that this is a short-term hit I need to take for the bigger picture whereby Japan economically stabilizes and becomes a superpower. This will not happen, and as opening opposition pointed out, large numbers of people get hurt. What opening opposition didn't point out is the consequences of said hurt. That's where we'll extend this first opposition, right? So what are the consequences of this? Let's say this reinforces the rhetoric that we are essentially selling out to the United States by accepting the victor's version of history, right? Given the fact that the United States also committed war crimes, it quite simply means that factions within the Japanese nationalists will be able to point out the hypocrisy of the current state in terms of selling out to the United States. What this means is that the correct consensus in Parliament with regards to the national rhetoric, the political discourse having to be focused on economics. The same plank in which Shinzo Abe beat the opposition leader in the last elections, who had run on a plank of hardcore jingoist nationalism, saying that we will do bad things to China. You revitalize those sentiments when you hurt and deeply hurt those sentiments of a large number of people. What this means is, it's much harder for Shinzo Abe now to get consensus in Parliament that we need to institute reforms of these kinds, reforms that are deeply important for the Japanese economy, because he's bringing about structural changes which take long term to grow, to trying to not go the way of large sovereign debt which has seen the Eurozone effectively collapse. We think Abe requires all the support that he can get, but you inflame nationalists in Parliament and allow them to hijack the discourse and take it to other issues. It's much harder to do this. We hurt Japan currently, something nobody has talked about. Sit down. We also say that Japan might actually need to militarize, and you heard the possibility when you inside soldiers. Before that, I take opening.
Okay, you are correct. We have to clarify things in the country, like our economic relationship with China. But the open person may have like some experience and may think that they're trying like communities all day. That's not what China thinks, right? And that's what is important.
I'll come to how China will respond. We don't think China will respond in the way you think. I'll tell you how they'll actually respond, right? Moving on to why they might need to militarize. Right. Given the escalating tensions in the Senkaku Islands and the territorial water disputes, given the fact that China has actually crossed its ambit and set up an illegal defense zone in the waters of that region, given the recent skirmishes between Japanese and Chinese military, and given the path of capitalism that closing government characterized that Japan has followed, we think Japan is deeply incapable right now of dealing with an all-out Chinese aggression. What this means is they require the US to be a party to this, right? Why this is problematic is, if Japan accepts that they were wrong, it becomes much harder for Obama to justify to taxpayers as to why they want to have a defense agreement with Japan in the first place, because the taxpayers would not want to be party to a war, which is illegitimate, and the other side that is now viewed as illegitimate, because they say they are illegitimate, right? That's the one problem. Secondly, given that Japan might not be able to rely on USA for various reasons, such as the fact that the US is reluctant to antagonize China, given its economic leverage over them in terms of currency reserves, etc., given the fact that they've never actually painted just currency manipulators, in fact, largely threatening to do so, we don't think the USA is actually going to come toward Japan's aid in the case of conflicts. They might need to grow militarily. That can't happen if nobody wants to become a soldier, because soldiers are shamed publicly for no fault of their own, despite not committing a crime. Finally, as to what China will do, we don't think China will back down, right? We think China has not backed down in Tibet or Taiwan and will not back down in Singapore. Instead, what they've managed is to make sure that the international community is largely stop engaging on Taiwan and Tibet, right? When Japan accepts that it was wrong, it becomes much easier for China to use that rhetoric to impose diplomatic pressure on other countries and ensure that the international heat of this issue dies down. More importantly, they said China will stop cooperating economically. We think that's wrong for several reasons, right? Despite the various problems China has had with Japan with regards to the rape of land, they haven't actually shut down economic ties with Japan. Japan happens to be the largest importer of rare earth minerals and the largest exporter of heavy electronics such as their electronics companies in China. We don't think trade ties have suffered. We don't see an apology necessary to correct a situation that isn't heard in the first place.